Hey, get in, fellas. We're going back to therapy. It's session 16. Sweet 16, if I do say so myself. We're going to be covering a wide range of topics. First, you all heard of the golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated. We're going to touch today on the platinum rule, which is treating people how they want to be treated. I know, crazy concept. We've been working on it, though, here as KGBs. Then we're going to dive deeper into the psychodynamic block, and we're going to cover Freud Shit with my guy, Dr. Demko. You're going to love this interview. He bleeds Freud, and you can tell all the way through the interview. Then we're going to wrap with a Bro Emotional Hall of Fame member that makes total sense and no sense at all, SNL's Pete Davidson. All right, y'all, let's go. How we doing, y'all? Happy Wednesday, or whenever you're picking up this episode. Stoked to really touch on a rule, on a concept that honestly is pretty new to me just by the name of it, but not by the concept, and especially not if you've been listening to this show all along. So it is the Freud Shit episode, so let's make sure we got Pink Freud mounted up on the camera. So we've all heard of the golden rule. That is the idea that we treat people how we want to be treated, right? The old adage of treat somebody how you'd want to be treated and you're doing just fine. The platinum rule implies that you are treating people how they want to be treated, which is like a lot harder. It's easy to know what we want. It's much harder to understand what someone else wants. We've all heard, again, the old idiom of walk a mile in someone's shoes or put yourself in their shoes. This is essentially what we're being asked to do when we're entertaining the platinum rule. It's hard. If you sitting here at home are thinking to yourself, Dr. Solomon, I don't need to hear this. I already treat people how they want to be treated. Well, then you've already graduated from therapy and you're probably more self-actualized than I am, because this is something that is very hard. The idea that humans would inherently be able to understand people's point of view is absolutely untrue. No science, no psychology, no hard or soft science would agree with that. We pop out the womb in our own little world. You're going to hear this consistently in psychodynamic block, and trigger warning, I'm going to use a big scary word called narcissism. We all pop out the womb as little baby narcissists. Okay, so suck that up and listen. The idea is that we need to take care of our own needs, and our parents are just two people whose job it is to take care of our needs. Make sure we're fed, soothed, clothed, warm, butts dry, all that. All right, so in general, think about how development goes. If we pop out the womb thinking only about ourselves, then there is not a guarantee that we're going to be able to develop a skill of understanding other people's perspectives. In fact, no apologies here, I would argue that most people walking this earth are not very good at understanding other people's perspectives. Hence my whole goal of this podcast. It implies that you can get out of your own head, just absolve yourself of your own bullshit, and truly understand the perspective of someone else. So humans are inherently narcissistic. That feeling of, what did I do wrong? When someone looks at you funny and you start thinking like all these things about you, social anxiety is a narcissistic trait, right? You're worried so much about what everybody else is going to think that you can't even talk yourself into believing that nobody gives a fuck. So that kind of worry about what other people think, that's adolescent, guys, right? So not all of us have matured so far along that we are so good at putting ourselves in other people's shoes. And we all know that teenagers suck at it. Yeah. So if we're still struggling with those kinds of themes, and this is work that still has to be done. How do we know? How do we practice this idea of putting ourselves in someone else's shoes? Well, it's hard. You might ask. You might straight up ask somebody, what are you feeling right now? What should I know that I don't understand right now? Especially if you are talking to somebody in a way that seems to make sense for you and you're not hitting the mark, then I would ask you to communicate and validate and say, hey, it seems like you're angry and I'm not quite sure why. Can you help me understand? Which is a very hard thing to say when you're in the midst of conflict, right? When you're trying to support somebody and you realize you're coming up short, well, then you're going to have the shame, you're going to have the embarrassment, you're going to have all the normal feelings that come with not hitting the mark because you want to be helpful. And that's okay. It takes a lot of courage to, ask. Essentially, you're asking for help. Yeah. So these are going to be themes that we continue to think on during this psychodynamic block. One, the inherent narcissism of humans, which is it is okay to admit that humans in general are looking out for number one. Doesn't mean you're not a good person. Growth does imply that we understand that our needs are met and that we do not have to put other people in harm's way in order to get our needs met. And we've all met people who are happy to step on each other's throats or note that everybody's looking out for number one, those kinds of things. That's not a lesson that we want to be learning as KGBs. And we also know that it's out there. Yeah. So as you seek to, seek first to understand is one of the 7 habits of highly effective people, it might take some learning. It might take some growth. Yeah. So I want everybody to be practicing that same motto that we talked about a few weeks ago, which is when we're feeling judgmental, if we could be curious instead and really work to understand people's point of views, we're going to get better at this. Okay. So next time, kind of the motto here is next time you're thinking about how to treat somebody and your mind goes to what you've been told since you were a child, which is the golden rule, treat people how you want to be treated. KGBs were better than that. I want you to think to yourself, how might they want to be treated? And if you don't know, let's say you're a male or a woman and you don't think you can fully understand the perspective of the other gender, then fucking ask. If you're a boss at work and you have a subordinate who doesn't seem to be responding well to your support, ask them how they do better. Okay. This is the only way you're going to learn, because even if you go try and research stuff, you're probably going to miss the mark for that individual person. So if somebody's important enough in your life that you'd like to be providing them emotional support, then this is worth your time and investment. All right. So again, not how we want to be treated, how they want to be treated. On more themes like this, we're going to go talk about Freud shit with my boy, Zack Demko. Stoked, y'all. It's a wild fucking ride, this interview. See you on the flip side. All right, so welcome back, friends. I'm really excited to bring in one of my good pals again from training, Dr. Zackary Demko. You can see we're continuing on with our Freud shit block, and today is Freud-based. Everything we're going to do is talk about Freud today. We continue to be dressed up. We'll also be in bro. Zach, show the people what you got under your shirt. There we go. Halo 2. So Zackary Demko, a native of New Jersey, he's a complicated bro, a man of many interests. His sports teams, the New Jersey Devils, the Florida Gators, boo, and the New York Giants, I don't have to say boo because they just stink. A complex man. He enjoys many instruments. He plays a lot of music. If you see behind him, he's got many stringed instrument and even some drums back there. It's a family affair in the Demko family. Dad was in a band, right?
Oh, yeah.
Joey D, fucking legend. But also a man of multitudes, Halo, and a consistent D&D player, Dungeons and Dragons.
Every month, baby, with my old guys.
Zach and his wife, Sam, were dear friends of mine here in Denver for my first few years out here. And then he did his child and adolescent psychiatry training in Nashville at Vanderbilt. Maybe you've heard of it. Zach now is a clinical director at an inpatient unit at a private psychiatric hospital outside of Nashville. So we talked with Satish. Those were kids who were medically admitted, and then they needed a psychiatrist. Zach would be the doctor that a kid would see if they were admitted to the hospital. Zach, why don't you tell the people who haven't really thought about an inpatient unit, like what brings a kid into the hospital and what are the goals when a kid and their family arrive?
That's a great question, Dr. Solomon. And thank you for having me on here. I'm super excited and very nervous as well, as I'm sure you could tell. But
love vulnerability. Look at him go. He's already starting out. A role model father of two, Zackary.
So goal for the acute inpatient unit is acute stabilization. So there's a lot of things that bring kids into the hospital. The most common would be either suicidal thoughts or a recent suicide attempt. Mm-hmm. But other things, we have earlier onset psychotic episodes or acute mania, things like that, where somebody is like gravely disabled because of their psychiatric illness. They're unable to meet their basic needs. In the adolescent world, we obviously deal with a lot of like psychosocial stressors too. So a lot of kind of complex situations where things may have been able to be managed in more of an intensive outpatient type setting, but are limited because of social stressors that are going on. So kids being recently taken into state custody, or the parent themselves is admitted for some sort of psychiatric illness or something of that nature, and they don't quite have that support network in place to kind of help them maintain safety outside of an acute inpatient setting at that time. So we do like brief stabilization. You know, as a therapy nerd, it's a challenging setting for me to work in sometimes, because I have to really kind of be fine-toothed with some of my therapeutic interventions. It's a lot of like brief psychotherapeutic interventions, because the focus is always to get kids out of the hospital as quickly as possible, for a number of reasons, but obviously wanting to make sure that it's safe beforehand.
The number of reasons that he's referring to is insurance coverage. He did not want to say that because that is not my job, and so I don't give a fuck to say it. Child psychiatric admissions used to be very helpful things. You were there for a long time, and the family was armed with a lot of skills. So situations, insurance coverage, money has dictated these treatments be much shorter. Now, pros and cons to that, right, Zach? The idea of any kid getting admitted psychiatrically points to the fact that there's probably work to be done within the home. We're not blaming. These are the situations. Like Zach said, a lot of these parents themselves also are having medical admissions or psychiatric admissions. It's intergenerational trauma. It's that kind of stuff. So a lot of that good work is done outside of the hospital. And ideally, we'd be getting these kids the kind of resources to prevent them from coming back. And so that's the idea here. Zach also runs an intensive outpatient program. And so that means that after these kids are in the hospital, they have the same program Zach runs will have, it's 3 days a week, an intensive outpatient program. So that means you're getting treatment. What would you say? Is your program 4 hours a day, Zach? What's kind of average?
Yeah, 3 hours, 4 to 7 p.m., 3 days a week. So they can come after school, after they're discharged, so they're not missing any more school. We take community referrals for that as well. So a means of kind of trying to prevent people from needing to go into the inpatient setting. Maybe you're doing weekly therapy and it's just not quite cutting it. Or you need some of that more like group work type thing. And so it runs for about like 4 weeks or so, but we'll flex it a little bit longer if you need a little bit
depending
more
on
time.
the kid.
A lot of like therapy focused group work, that sort of thing, with a little med management kind of sprinkled in.
Yeah, Zach, I was doing my hands because it's like a step up, step down process when you think about mental health. Okay. So Satish and Zach, what they do is this inpatient level of care, which is, the highest you could be if you need to be safe. We need to keep you at the hospital. You need to be safe. Partial hospitalization is a program where you're essentially there all day, 5 days a week, sometimes including the weekends, but not always. Intensive outpatient, like Zach said, kind of 3 days a week, 3 or 4 hours a day. For kids, that should include parent programming as well as kid programming. And then outpatient is what I do. So I see people, they come to my office once a week, once every other week, and those kinds of things. So that's an idea of where treatment can look like in psychiatry, just kind of generally, as I don't think that's something we touched upon. So thanks, Zach. So as a therapy nerd, when I started developing this Freud Shit block, Zach was at the front of the line for people who wanted to talk Freud, and boy, are we excited. We talked about this last episode, Zach, in the intro with Satish, and I've touched on it in the Bro Emotions Hall of Fame as well. We are pro Freud, and I think if we're going to try and have you all take one thing away, is it's as weird as you think, and then not as weird as you think. So we're going to try and find ways to explain these obviously strange concepts that he introduced, while also reminding you what I've been saying the whole time, which is without Freud, we may not have therapy, and we certainly wouldn't have therapy as we know it today. So if we go back in the time machine, it's 1885. Freud's a young buck neurologist dealing with the idea and the fact that neurology research just ain't that interesting at the time. We can't use MRIs. We don't know what's going on in the brain. We don't really have any idea. He had a mentor named Jean Charcot. If you're a medical nerd, you'll know that Charcot has a bunch of different diseases named after him because he loved himself that much. And he practiced hypnosis. Freud was learning hypnosis. And the difference between hypnosis as we know it, what Freud developed it into later and what Charcot was doing was he was using suggestion. So the idea that you put somebody under hypnosis in a trance-like state, and then you are essentially suggesting to them behaviors and thoughts and things along those lines. And so we understand that. It's also why we understand hypnosis as a treatment is a rather complicated concept. Freud went on to use hypnosis for a little while. And the idea for him with hypnosis was not suggestion, rather that letting people say whatever happens in that hypnotic stand, in that hypnotic trance, was their opportunity to say things that they might not otherwise say. It's not that much different, Zach, than if we're using psychedelics, for example. Nowadays, we're using MDMA, ketamine, psilocybin, and the same idea is to get people out of their heads, not defended, and say what's on their mind.
Even EMDR, I think you could make an argument, is kind of hypnosis adjacent there, kind of breaking down the filter.
EMDR. So if you haven't heard of EMDR, it's a specific kind of trauma treatment. So eye movement. Oh God, what's the D?
Desensitization.
What's the R?
Rehabilitation, I believe.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not certified in it. God bless if you are, because it's a lot of hard work and you're dealing with a lot of people's trauma. But it's
giving me time off from clinic when we were in residency.
I was actually supposed to get certified in it, and then the person at the VA went on like a maternity leave or some sort of leave, so I was sad-faced. But EMDR is a trauma therapy that we use. And Zach's saying, so the idea of we're using eye movements and repetitive patterns to kind of send yourself into more of like a meditative state. And so, Freud went on from doing hypnosis. If you've, been a Freud nerd or you took Psycho 101, you've heard of his early, most famous patient, Anna O, who herself coined the term the talking cure. That is what she said that Freud was doing with her, was just talking about stuff until it seemed like she could make more sense of it. Freud, you went on to use the term free association to explain this process of what he was having people do, because Freud's big thing was that these symptoms that these women, mostly women that were referred to him, if you remember from last episode, who were showing hysterical symptoms or symptoms that seemed like they'd be coming from the brain when there was no real brain origin for these symptoms. So he believed, and really stuck to that throughout his career in different ways and shapes and forms, is that whatever bad memories we have from our lives repressed within our brain, repressing meaning that we stuck it all the way the fuck back there, locked it in a box with a key, and we're not going to touch it. Everybody listening to this podcast has had this experience. Don't act like you haven't. You know that there's stuff in there that you've chosen not to remember. And if it were to come up again, it would fuck you up. So that's the idea. Freud understood that these weird ways these symptoms were coming out was due to people repressing these memories. The idea of free association, allowing people just to talk and talk and talk and talk until they could talk about these things that were packed away. And that if they could talk and make sense of them, the symptoms would alleviate. And frankly, for the first time in the history of these types of symptoms, they started to. 1896, Freud coined the term psychoanalysis, and it was on from there. Zach, when you think about psychoanalysis, what are some of the highlights, the things that people may have heard of? Let's talk about the stuff, let's talk about the sexy stuff.
Yo, I think even just hearing your history lesson so far, which has been phenomenal, by the way, we already have something to be thankful for Freud about here, even if you disregard everything else that we talk about that he's done moving forward, which is that Freud is the one who has given us all the comics about a therapist that you've ever seen, because free association and the fundamentals of psychoanalysis are based upon this blank slate therapist who's kind of behind you while you lay in the chaise lounge so that they are free to be projected on.
I'm excitedly, just because we love Freud, I'm digging through the bag of all the souvenirs that I bought at the Freud Museum in Vienna, which is where our boy Pink Freud came from. Zach, I'll have to send you this next time I'm in Nashville or bring this to you, but they had these little bookmarks that were like the tapestry, the tapestry that was on his wall. So Freud very famously, guys, I mentioned this a few episodes ago, that the Freud Museum in Vienna was the home. Him, Anna, his daughter, who was also a famous therapist, developed the term defense mechanisms, coming next episode, is they lived together as a family, and their offices were also in the same apartment. So the museum is super cool. I was a big nerd. Zach, I think it's worth your flight to Vienna just to go. So I like it, so I think there's a lot of things people think about with Freud, and don't worry, guys, we're going to get to the sex stuff here in a minute. But if we're going in chronological order, Freud moved forward in this idea of, he was saying that neuroses or anxieties in general come from repressed memories. And again, the reason that people think it's so weird is that his core idea was that they were repressed sexual memories, sexual trauma, because a lot of the people he was seeing had real episodes of that was really happening. Freud then decided to do his own narcissistic journey of analyzing himself. Like you coked out, Interpretation of Dreams came out a few years later, which is this nonsensical diatribe of Freud interpreting his own dreams and also using that to like analyze his own hate for his father who passed away within this kind of self-analysis time. And it left us with Freud saying like, well, hold on, I don't think I was sexually traumatized, so where are my neuroses from? And he backed off that a little bit, at least there in that window of time. Zach, well, like when you think about interpretation of dreams, like, do you like to think of, do you think about that stuff a lot? I don't think about it too much with patients.
I love talking about dreams with patients. I think that there is a very controversial and numerous number of ways that people approach dream interpretation in psychotherapy. I for one take an approach more of like the dream is significant in the way that is significant to the patient. For Freud, when he spoke about these dreams, everything that you could remember from the dream was some sort of metaphor or symbol for some sort of repressed memory or sexual urge or aggressive urge. There was like a meaning for every single part of it. You see that now, I think, to an extreme in like pop culture examples where you can buy a dream interpretation book and they'll tell you, oh, if there was a snake in your dream, somebody's about to betray you, or you're worried about somebody about to betray you. And, this color means this specific thing, which is obviously, very, very, heavy-handed and just overly laid out in a specific way. The way that I approach the interpretation of dreams with my patients is to kind of allow them to explore the dream themselves and tell me what they think the significance is there. Because even if there was some repressed memory that caused that dream and we're missing it from their initial interpretation, if they're finding significance in it and it's driving the conversation or their dialogue, then it's still beneficial towards the therapy. And that, that's another thing that we owe to Freud from kind of what you were talking about earlier, is this, the importance of the talk therapy being the therapist as a role of a listener, right? As opposed to like a life coach where they're telling you what to do. So, him sitting behind the person and letting them do the talking, it makes sense that he then thought that he could analyze himself, because he's basically seeing these people analyze themselves through him. And it seems like kind of tried to cut out the middleman there, which as we know now is not quite as effective. And so if you feel like undergoing psychoanalysis, please find somebody to do it with.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, Zach, though, I do get patients who come to me who feel like they've done a lot of this on their own. One of my favorite guys really likes using AI, and he didn't come to see me until he had programmed an AI program with as much like Freud, Jung, everything he could find, and then tried to program it with like himself and his story. And it was so fun. And then I was like, how like helpful was it? He was like, well, I'm still here to see you, aren't I? So I think people do often try to do these things on their own. And it's, I mean, I couldn't do it on my own, Zach. You couldn't do it on your own. It's inherently impossible because we are all blocked by our own bullshit. I can't see you're going to lie to yourself. You're going to defend you're going to be defended. But I'd also imagine that if any of us did as much blow as Freud did, we might think we could. And so that is something we know. And, Zach, I think what's so nice about dream interpretation is that it did lead to one of Freud's main theories. And I'm going to give a visual on this one, which is the structural theory of the mind. If you've taken Psych 101, you've heard of the structural theory of the mind. So the idea here, and Zach and I will both try and take swings at this somewhat complicated concept, is that we have ourselves. If you want to think about this, where I have the angel and the devil, we as people are the ego. The ego is the part of ourselves, like this picture of it floating out of the water. It is mostly living in the conscious world, meaning you are aware of what's going on. Your ego is interacting with other people, and it is receiving input from your superego, who we could think of as your angel. That is your conscience. That's somebody that's your superego is dictated throughout your early life when you learn rules, you go to school, you learn how to be responsible, you learn how to live in a society. So think of the superego as the angel on your shoulder telling you to do, quote, the right thing. The id is hanging out underneath. You don't really know what the id is saying. It's kind of whispering in your ear quietly. That's why it's all the way under the water. And it's like the devil. Zach, tell people about the drives. I think we think of Freud and we think of like, oh, all he talked about was sex. Really, he got to a more important point.
Yes. And I think part of that is that essentially he kind of narrowed the drives down to two categories, which was sex and aggression. And I think part of the reason that is so off-putting to people is that they're like, well, I feel so many more things that motivate me than that. And so at times it can be helpful to sometimes conceptualize like at least the sexual side of things as more of like a search for pleasure or some kind of enjoyment, that sort of thing. And, if anybody has spent a significant amount of time around a toddler, then you know that they are driven by the id. They do not have that super ego to tell them, don't go just rip this toy out of somebody else's hand because you want it. And don't do things like randomly smash things just because it seems somewhat interesting, right? Even down to the basics of like kids, stomp on bugs or animals or things like that. And they have to learn. And it's not that they are inherently evil in some sort of way. It's that initially they lack this super ego to kind of contain some of these like raw urges that help them to explore the world and learn about those societal norms and rules and regulations that exist, and also help them understand the physical objects around them as they come into being from initially being this very nebulous lack of self.
And the idea gets more complicated by the idea, and again, this is something that was Freud driven. Nobody was thinking about the idea of the unconscious, the conscious, and the preconscious minds before this, right? So we forgive somebody who wasn't perfect in the idea of something that we all kind of come to accept now, right? Like we accept the idea of conscious and unconscious thinking. Is there anything beyond a theory with it? Is there anything beyond like a thing we all kind of agree with, that we have some things that are going on in our head all the time that we know, we call it the front of our brain, and then a bunch of stuff going on back here that we're constantly filtering, we're constantly sorting. And so, that idea that we do things that we don't understand why we do them, this is the idea, is that things move so fast for humans that generally we don't even know when we're being driven by something that's in this unconscious. I have a hard time explaining the idea of the preconscious, honestly, Zach. Do you think you have a way of helping conceptualize it?
Yeah, so I would kind of describe the preconscious as that which is accessible in your brain, but you're not thinking about in the moment. So it's something that can be brought up by, if I say like, think about what you had for dinner last night. You weren't thinking about that in the moment, but now it's in your brain and you can remember it. So obviously, that's one that probably isn't impacting so much of your day to day, depending on how good or bad the meal was. But there are lots of things that we have access to that we can remember, that we're like, oh yeah, I'm feeling bummed out today because of this that happened yesterday, even though I wasn't thinking about it in the moment. Or if you've ever had times where you're like, I'm so anxious. What's going on? Oh, right. I have to appear on a podcast with Steven tonight and talk about a whole bunch of really complicated Freud stuff. That's why I'm feeling anxious right now. That would be preconscious, right? And unconscious would be far deeper and not something that I would be able to get to just by myself. Ultimately, this is the thing that we should be the most grateful to Freud for. Because as much as I love these comics and everything like that have come as jokes about him, this was a radical idea at the time, that there would be thoughts or feelings or memories or things like that we did not have access to in our brain. And like you said, it's something that we often take for granted now. And it was controversial because it was a challenging thing to tell people like, hey, there's actually a lot of stuff that's going on inside your own head that you don't even know about. That's a scary concept if you've never thought about that before. And there's also other implications in terms of, the greater societies of the time and thinking about like who man is above beast, and religious implications of all this stuff of like, there's stuff going on that you don't even know about that's inside of your own head kind of thing.
And what's also true is you talked about kind of religious implications. It's like at the time, it was threatening to society to be putting this stuff out there. A generally Judeo-Christian society is not embracing sex. It's not embracing sexuality. Those things are not really welcomed in our culture. And Satish and I talked about this last week. American society in general is weirded out by these things because if you believe it or not, people, America is a sexually repressed culture. And so we don't want to embrace these ideas. And so that, I believe, is a lot of why Freud has gotten the rap he's gotten out in this world, is because, people generally speaking don't want to be thinking about that stuff for any number of reasons, right? People's stories, religious influence, and other reasons. But again, like, this is all stuff we use in pop culture. We talk about the unconscious mind. We talk about defense mechanisms. Like Zach said, if you're on the Instagram, you'll see me giving a pop culture example of one every single day during these few weeks. And then think about like Freudian slips. Guys, this is a perfect example of that, right? When you say one thing, but then you mean fuck your mother, right? So these ideas of like, you have a slip of tongue and there's no other reason to have that except for the fact that we as people don't really even know the words that are coming out of our mouth until they're already out of our mouth for the most part. And so that idea is like, where are those words coming from? What's going on? We all have thoughts all day that we wish we wouldn't have. We're not in control of those thoughts. I think that bothers people, Zach. I think the idea that we don't control our own thoughts is unnerving for people.
Absolutely. And I think that's a reason that people are drawn to a lot of other types of therapy that are more kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy, or things that are focused on kind of like, what are the tools that I can use? I just want to fix things right now and move forward. And how can I make this the best? And at the same time, I feel like a lot of those people ultimately end up saying something along the lines of like, well, I got to get deeper, or figure out like, what's the root of the issue, or where is this coming from? And all of that ultimately relies on the existence of this concept of the unconscious, that there's something that's not immediately readily available in your mind that otherwise you'd know how to fix it, right?
Yeah.
If you could tell me exactly the source of your anxiety, well, you would be able to just kind of like reason your way through it through basic CBT skills, and you'd never need another day of therapy in your life. These things keep coming up because they are buried deeper.
Super hardcore analysts will talk about how behavior therapies like CBT and DBT actually keep somebody within a role where the parental figure is telling you what to do, because you don't have free will necessarily within a cognitive behavioral or a dialectical behavior, which I don't necessarily agree with.
I love some CBT, especially speaking back to our brief psychotherapeutic interventions. That's exactly the kind of stuff that I'm doing on the inpatient side of things. We are not opening this can of worms and ripping open your unconscious while you're surrounded by 15 other suicidal teenagers in a psychiatric hospital away from all your sports.
And hopefully,
we are doing those basic CBT skills, and we are going to set you up so that you can go find somebody that you feel comfortable with, that you can be open and honest with, so that you can engage in this kind of deeper therapy in the future when you are ready.
Yeah, and this is it's I hope anybody who's watching at this, what are we, episode 16, week 16, holla, is on board with the idea that like we're all just fucking figuring this out as people. Like, LOL to the idea that humans have any idea what the fuck is going on with humans, right? And so think about every 50 years, every 20 years, fuck, every 10 with technology, right? There's a new wave of information, a new wave of our understanding that'll get debunked 20 or 30 years from now. So, of course, these types of therapies, CBT and DBT, are needed because they have been helpful. They've proven to people. I can give people hope. If you've been watching the previous, 15 episodes of this, you're going to hear how much this has benefited me. I'm sure Zach as well, right? And anybody else who's going to come on this podcast will talk about how all these things have been helpful. Zach, I appreciate you being so honest. Before we get to probably Freud's juiciest topic, I wanted to be vulnerable as well about the anxiety. This stuff's complicated, guys. I can get if you listen to this and you're like, what am I supposed to be getting about it? And also, it's so important to me and what I've learned through this process and understanding some of these deeper psychodynamic themes. Again, defenses, understanding attachment, understanding development and family systems and interactions like that I've been like a fucking wreck trying to figure out the right way to take this complicated stuff and like present it to you all. So Tarek and Satish and Zach have all been helpful for that, but it's because even all of us, we go back and read this stuff and then we all talk about like, is it like this? So then you have this patient and that patient. So again, we're all just kind of figuring it out. So I really like Zach's response about the dreams, which is like kind of like I talked about last week with needing your history. A dream is as relevant as it's informing your life right now. And Zach, I wonder if as we shift out of dreams, if you think of nightmares, if you think of traumatic nightmares any differently, It's hard to say, because I'll have patients who will literally in their sleep, and I'm sure many people on this podcast will have that as well, where they're re-experiencing the actual traumatic moments in their dreams. I don't spend a lot of time interpreting it with patients because frankly, I've never found it helpful, right? It is the idea this is
Right.
happening. You wake up in a panic, your fight or flight system is activated. And so I think most people listening to this podcast will have heard of PTSD. And if you have these traumatic memories that aren't fully repressed, then they kind of can come back in your dreams. Your dreams is like the unconscious, preconscious border, And so I don't know, do you spend time with patients differently when it comes to like, post-traumatic nightmares that are so solid? Do you treat that any differently?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's something that we are often trying to do everything we can to stop, right? Because obviously that's something that's disruptive to your functioning on a basic level, and we will use CBT for insomnia or other like mindfulness or meditation techniques that people can do before bed. We'll use medications that tone down that fight or flight response. And I think that part of that is that those dreams, from my interpretation of them, would be they're a little bit more coming from that lizard brain, reptilian kind of physiological, you need to gain mastery over this threat so that it can't hurt you again, and so you're going to re-experience it over and over and over again until you figure out how you're going to make sure that this never happens again. Or it's going to remind you, like, even when you are sleeping, you got to stay on your toes so that something like this does not happen again. And that's
which
I'm
is disruptive to day-to-day life.
Exactly. Yeah. So with that one, the retelling of those dreams, I think, would be helpful in the circumstances where somebody is engaged in specific trauma focused therapy, often where they're trying to kind of reclaim that narrative, and the dream might be an opportunity to afford them the chance to kind of tell that story again in the way that allows them to gain some mastery of it. We know that traumatic memories are stored in our brain differently than normal episodic memories, and we know that those things can change over time with therapy. We know that there are physical changes to your brain that can happen from engaging in trauma focused therapy, things that can be seen on imaging. And that comes oftentimes in the trauma setting from shifting the way that those memories are stored, taking them away from the senses and the I remember the way that it smelled, or the temperature, or what I was, the way my clothes felt on my body, that sort of thing, and taking it towards the way that you might tell a story about what you did on your birthday.
All these years later, it goes back 130 years now to Freud's initial thinking of like, a lot of these symptoms do come from repression of these memories. Like you said, traumatic memories being stored differently. So Zack has used terms like build mastery over, reclaim. I like to say we need to integrate these events into our life story. And the idea that Zack said, and the role of medications, which we'll only touch on here and there, Zack, on the show, is that I need to be able to have you tell this story and do it without coming totally unglued. And sometimes, unfortunately, that does require medications. But if anybody has actually read one of our book recommendations from a few months ago with Mark, The Whole Brain Child teaches us how to work with a kid who experienced something scary, and how to have them. We even teach toddlers, talk about it, because the more they talk about it, the less scary it is to them. And we don't really they can't verbalize exactly how they're integrating it. But let's say a kid saw a car crash. We know the treatment, and this is why we do play therapy, right? The treatment is for them to tell that story. The more that a parent tells them to just forget about it, the less likely they are to recover from that event. And so that's stuff that we then take into adulthood with more adult, forms of PTSD like we're describing. And so I just, Zack, to this whole point, it's all this stuff kind of comes around in circles, right? This kind of therapy, that kind of therapy. But even all these years later, we're still rolling with that idea when we treat trauma that we have to get this stuff. It's, again, the whole point of psychedelics. I think the same people who might not understand what Freud was talking about are going to be all about psychedelics. And it's like, motherfucker, it's the same idea. You're locked in. You refuse to talk about these things. You're stuck. You're defended. We're gonna psychedelically flood your serotonin like a motherfucker until you start talking, whether you like it or not. And so that shit's just hot in the streets. So a dear friend of Dr. Demko's and I, Dr. Kylie House, will be on, I don't know, sometime whenever we decide to do psychedelics. She does that shit for a living. So As we transition out of dreams, Zach, I want to make sure I shout out one of my dearest people in my life, my little sister, Abby, who, as I was training to become a therapist, always wanted to talk about her dreams. And I just was like, it's not that important. So I imagine she's going to be pissy to be like, hold on, you just did 20 minutes on dreams and you've been telling me for years, let's just not think about it. It's not worth our time. So sorry, Abby Beth. Love you dearly. Can't wait to see you next week when you come to town.
She's vindicated.
Yeah, there we go, Grill. Not a girl. And so the Oedipal complex. I think this is the juice that Zach and I have been talking about. How do you hit on, some of these more sexual themes that have really given Freud the definition, the kind of reputation that he's had. So Zach, give just, if you've been living under a rock for your entire life, what is the Oedipal complex? And so we can set the stage.
Yes. So the foundation, and I'm going to be as weird as possible about it initially so that we can make it less weird moving forward. But essentially the Oedipal complex is a concept that at some point during, with Freud, I'm going to use the traditional kind of gender norms that Freud had used at the time as well.
Hey, blame Shakespeare.
What's that?
Freud gets a bad rap. Blame Shakespeare. He started this whole thing.
We're going back to ancient Greece if we want to really get with the myths.
Sex shit's been weird forever, guys.
It's been around for a long time.
Sex shit's been weird.
We want to lay that first. Oedipus Rex, the mythology in ancient Greece is that he is predestined from fate to kill his father, so his parents abandon him in the middle of nowhere. He's saved by a shepherd who raises him one day at a crossing. They can't decide whose cart's going to go fast. He kills a random guy over this small squabble, continues on to the city. Turns out that he had killed the husband of an important woman there who he falls in love with and marries, and later is revealed to be his mother, and he had killed his father at the crossroads and then punished eternally for his sins after gouging his eyes out.
Give me a round of applause quickly here for Dr. Zachary Demko laying down that mythology for us. Good shit.
So Freud's concept is that at an early age in a young man's life, he develops sexual urges towards his mother. And his initial concept with that, this would be something that is kind of around typically like kindergarten age. There's a range of ages that they say typically. I think the widest that I see is like 3 to 8 years old kind of thing. But it's this early childhood concept where, especially this, again, makes people feel weird about it because they're like, what 5-year-old is thinking about sex, and certainly about sex with their mother. But the way that he had formulated it was that there would be these sexual urges towards the mother, and that the resolution of it would be repression of those sexual urges, largely resolved through fear of the father. And that you would hear the term castration anxiety, where the concern is that, well, my father is going to cut off my penis if I want to have sex with my mother. And so I need to bury this stuff deep down, which sounds so weird.
So weird.
So I would like to.
Was not in the Shakespeare play. That's where it got weird.
They left that part out. The editors struck that one.
Yeah.
Before it hit the stage, but
scroll Quillen ink pen on the scroll. Actually, that would have been what Freud was using, or not Freud, Shakespeare.
It's evoking the image. But the way that we can conceptualize this as being relevant and the way that we see it play out is that it's a concept that focuses on recognizing that there are relationships that exist outside of ourselves. So, early child is the center of their universe. They don't perceive anything beyond kind of the way that they are perceiving things. And, there's wonderful examples and studies related to this, especially like, the Piaget trials with kids kind of looking at different things and saying what other people can see, or all of these kind of basic foundations of their brain that develop over time where they can't conceptualize that anybody would not be thinking exactly what they are thinking or feeling the way that they are feeling, or have the knowledge that they have, that sort of thing. And part of that, as they reach a certain age, is recognizing that other people sometimes interact with each other and it's not about me. And the person that is most important to them is typically their maternal caregiver in that context. And so the crux of this and the way that it becomes relevant now is that the child starts to recognize, like, mom and dad have stuff going on that I'm not a part of. They do some things that are differently than the way that we interact. They kiss each other differently. They
I
get to
was
share a
just
bed
gonna say
together. I sleep in the other room, that sort of
and like
thing.
the most common video that we see on fucking internet is like a kid trying to like jump into the kiss between their parents, right? Like that is, I don't know, top 5 most common fucking video people post on the internet these days. Like, oh, look
How
how
many
cute this
times
is.
do you see their friends on
This
Instagram? They're like, we can't get a moment to ourselves. He's always, every time we start to have a moment, here he is making it about himself, that sort of thing.
It's
Exactly.
exactly what we're talking about, guys, right? It's the same idea that these kids see, and then they start to model their relationships based on what they're seeing. So, Zach and I have tried to talk about how do we do this in a less like gender normative way. I mean, this is what we were, what we were dealing with again in the early 1900s when Freud was coming with this stuff. But the idea being that a biologically male child identifies with with their male father, and then again desires their mother. As Zach alluded to, like the inevitably this is resolved by this kid growing up enough to realize that whatever's going on in the home isn't their primary thing. They start going to school, they get crushes on other kids, they move on, they become teenagers, and they start fucking people that aren't their parents. So it's when it gets interesting, Zach, and maybe you could you're this is why we had Zach on. If you guys wanted, like, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on anything from here on out. This is the whole point of a transition to the show. So Zach, I brought you on thinking about, like, how would you explain the idea of resolving the Oedipal complex?
Yes. So that's something that I feel particularly passionate about because I think it's one of the things that has shifted so much over time. And it's something that I think about a lot as a father to 2 young boys and thinking about my own relationship with my father. Learning about the Oedipal complex the first time was something that was unsettling to me, thinking about, like, did I fear my dad in this way? Did I ever have that kind of anxiety? I feel like I have always been so close to my father, and I think that part of that is because just the way that family systems work now is so much different than it was at the time of Freud, obviously. So, when you think of what a father figure would have looked like at the time of Freud, and especially him thinking back to his own father, which would
Right,
have
his
been,
own.
earlier 1800s, the father was largely not involved in raising of kids, especially when they were young. It was, come to me when, you're ready to be a man and we can go, hunt together or something
Toss a
along those lines,
baseball of the
right?
day, have a
Yep.
catch, but there was no
Dad
catch yet.
goes to work and he comes home and he's just kind of angry or irritable. There's a lot of like corporal punishment and physical discipline. So dad is like an imposing, frightening figure for kids in that circumstance for the majority of time. And that's something that shifted over time. And when you and I were talking the other day, we talked about this concept of even just diaper changing, where it's like you look back at numbers in terms of the percentage of fathers that change diapers, and nowadays, fortunately, it's above 90% of dads are at least changing some of the poopy diapers, when you would hope it to be 100%. But you look back at like 40 years ago and it's like 50-50 if any of them have ever changed a diaper. So that's something that's changed a lot over time in terms of like fathers' involvement in early childhood, which helps to kind of conceptualize, like, how could you be thinking about a dad this way, where he's like such an evil authoritarian figure, that he's going to chop off my penis for these thoughts that I've been having, which
Yeah,
I
Freud was
imagine.
definitely layering his own bullshit into a lot of this stuff, right?
I
That's the
imagine
idea.
there was a lot of snow falling when he was coming up with the concept of castration anxiety and everything
Yeah.
like that, right? So now we think about other ways that this can resolve, and the foundation of kind of the resolution in earlier time is still this identification with the same sex parent, and almost with that kind of fear, identification with the aggressor, right? And what I think you are kind of already alluding to now is that kids now will see in a healthy relationship modeling from both of their parents in terms of ways that they can learn to identify and see a healthy relationship kind of play out, and the way that they can see it modeled to them, that they're still an important part of the family, even if there are things that are different, that love can exist and be as powerful but be different in another way. And I think that a lot of times the way that is then kind of conceptualized or would be interpreted now is that you have these kind of desires to be a core part of this relationship, and you say, well, it's different and I can't be that part of that relationship. That's that relationship that mom and dad exist. So maybe I'll try and foster things within myself so I can be like them, so I can have a relationship like this, which
is where latency really kind of takes off. So we go from the kind of toddler years into the 3, 4, 5-year-old years, and then latency. This isn't a Freud thing; it's an Erickson thing. But the idea of you get into elementary school, and that's when, again, this is all shifting, guys. But like gender normative roles are very important to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, right? You want to play trucks, you want to play dolls, you want to play ballet, you want to play football, right? Because that's your way of learning, who you are in the world, how to be, and how to start modeling around what you know to be true based on what your experiences have been. Zach, before we talk about some older pop culture examples of unresolved Oedipal complexes, I want to share Zach, not only from his own parenting, but found us some cute videos of some kids struggling with their own Oedipal complex.
Oh, okay. But do you know what engagement means?
What?
It means before you get married.
Mom will marry you.
Well, Ian got me this ring, so I think Ian wants to marry mommy.
No, you don't.
It's not okay that I marry your mom?
No, I want to marry my mom.
But I treat her real good, don't I?
I do too.
Oh, I know you do.
So I want to marry mommy. You not.
So that's an interesting situation there, Zach, because that's clearly the mom is going to have a second husband. And so you can imagine for this kid, the world doesn't make a ton of sense to him, but we don't know what's up with the dad. We don't know where he is, but this is the idea of this unresolved Oedipal complex is if the dad is out of the picture, then the son is going to continue to feel protective of mom, and he's not going to be able to what we would say, conquer the complex or win, is because it's unresolved. He doesn't really ever get put in his place by the male and continues to have somewhat of an unhealthy relationship with mom. Other ways this can be unhealthy is if the mom herself is over-sexualized towards the child. Or the father, either one, depending on the gender role or any of those things. And so a kid then kind of gets confused about what is my role within this relationship dynamic. And then we start getting into very sad stories of people who've had sexual trauma in their youth and what that looks like and how that shapes the way you see relationships, the way you see sex specifically.
Absolutely. And, I think a lot of times with concepts like this, some of the best ways to kind of understand them is to see the ways that they can go wrong. There are obviously like really horrible extreme examples, like some of the ones that you've alluded to there. There's more subtle things just in terms of kind of like, especially when you get into more common issues that can arise during that specific time, like divorce or things like that, or maybe dad moves away during this time when the child is saying like, there's a threat to my relationship with my mom and it's dad, and it just so happens that at that time that there are marital problems that are happening, or there's a tragic accident and they lose dad. And so we use this term Oedipal victor sometimes to kind of describe a circumstance where a child has kind of like come out on top. And ultimately, obviously, we know that it's not a victory because it's damaging to the way that their relationships are going to play out in the future. But any number of ways that can happen. A parent is sick and they're away in the hospital or something like that, and the child gets parentified or in some way. Maybe mom is struggling a lot because dad is sick and in the hospital, and she's overly reliant on the child for emotional support. And so he ends up kind of serving this role as a protector or an emotional support for mother or that sort of thing. And that enmeshment kind of like carries on moving forward.
Let's think, Zach. I was able to dig up a few good pop culture examples of Oedipal victors and Oedipal complexes unresolved. So one of the first ones that I thought about was Howard Wolowitz from The Big Bang Theory. So really common show. We know that Howard's father is not in the picture, and then Howard into his mid to late 20s continues to live with mother, who has this like domineering sense. We don't even actually see the mom. She's like this omnipresent figure in his life. And the idea there being that like he never really got to move on from their enmeshed relationship because, again, there was not a father in the picture to kind of help guide that process of him separating himself from that relationship with mom. Another popular example that I'm sure is going to piss people off because it always does is Friends. So Chandler Bing's mom is pretty sexual, and there's no shying away from that in the show Friends. And so then we see Chandler has some like weird anxieties around sex, and the idea there being that because the mom, it's through no fault of her own, right, is outwardly sexual around him, whether that be when he was young or as we see it in his young adulthood, he has trouble separating mom from sex. So obviously Friends is notorious, and we'll reference The Sopranos here all the time, but Tony Soprano, one of his girlfriends, ends up being a lot like his mother, and there's things along those lines that hint at the Oedipal complex. So it's like, Zach, I told you I wanted to make this headline that was like the Oedipal complex, not as weird as you think. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know 20 minutes later whether we made that point or not. I'm not sure.
It's still pretty weird.
It's still pretty weird. I don't know that I came out.
People are weird, man. People are weird. We have a lot of weird thoughts that we bury deep down. And part of the normal development is to be like, some of the thoughts I have are maybe a little too weird. And I probably should kind of keep those to myself a little bit. Not every thought needs to be shared or explored or held onto. It can be like, well, that's a weird thought. I don't think that fits within what my super ego would like. I'm just going to let that go away. And that I think I don't want to steal any thunder from defense mechanisms because I love it, but it's kind of the difference there that we're getting to between suppression and repression, where it's like these things are horrible and they're going to be gone whether I consciously choose to or not, or recognizing like sometimes I have weird thoughts. I don't need to focus on them. I'll let them kind of go into the backseat for the time.
Repression is you do not have access. Suppression is you're doing it consciously, right? Repression is an unconscious mind drive. And so, Zach, we're not taking steam away. I'm already doing it on the socials. I hope anybody hearing this is kind of getting bits and slices from those, from those clips. Zach, I know you saw Projection. I fucking patted myself on the back for that projective identification clip.
So good. That's the hardest one to ever describe. You nailed it. It was
my brain exploded. I've been running around asking all of my like non-psychiatric friends, like, will you watch this video and tell me if you understood what I just said? Because like I don't even know that I could restate and understand projective identification. I just was on a roll.
And I think that the cheating example is like one that's so particularly apt for that. There's a lyric from one of my favorite Taking Back Sunday songs that's about infidelity, where he says the double standard of suspicion, which is something that I think is that kind of thing where it's like this, like you're feeling suspicious, obviously, because of your own actions, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think the experience that many people can probably relate to, that's another great example, is when somebody thinks that you're mad. And they just keep asking you why you're mad or what you're mad about, that sort of thing, until you get to that point where you're like, I'm not mad. And then you have made the point for them, right? They're like 100% like, yes, you are. Exactly like you had kind of pointed out in your little
Glad within last week's episode, Zach, that we touched upon the idea of attention. And if somebody's asking you that over and over again, maybe we just validate. We say, hey, I can tell you're feeling insecure right now. What is going on? What is going, can we talk about what this is? I can see that you're uncomfortable. I'm not sure why. Can you, tell me more? And if the space is open, rather than when someone says, you mad at me, like, look, you're dating this person. You married this person. If that annoys you, then you shouldn't have been in this boat in the goddamn first place. Okay. So if somebody's going to ask you that kind of thing, it might be annoying as hell. Well, guess what? Here you are. So you better learn how to figure, how to treat them and be kind and be able to understand. Zach and Sam are a couple of fucking weirdos, and it's honestly one of my favorite relationships that I have experience with ever. So it's out there, it's cool. And honestly, Zach, thank you so much for coming. And I know you were nervous, and I think people can hear this off of us. Like, this interview's like damn near an hour. Satisha is like, there's just no way to talk about this stuff without it rambling, without it being confusing, without it just. So sit back, keep enjoying this ride with us for the next few weeks. And I promise the content will become more applicable again in season 2. Okay. So love y'all. We're going to induct a Bro Motions Hall of Fame member coming up. And then again, thank you, Zach. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, y'all, super excited to introduce this week's Promotions Hall of Fame inductee, actor Pete Davidson. Born on Staten Island, on Staten Island, in November 1993. It's well documented that Pete's dad, Scott, was a New York City firefighter who passed away during the 9/11 attacks as he helped save other people before the collapse of the buildings. And so Pete was 7 at this time. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a 7-year-old who, with no siblings, just him and mom at that point after the passing of their dad in such a tragic way. I mean, it's mind-blowing. So it's easy to understand what Pete's life has looked like since then. As a kid, he struggled so much that he'd ripped all the hair out of his head and was completely bald. And he's been very outspoken on the concept of suicidality and depression that he's struggled with throughout his life since that point. Shout out to last week's Promotions Hall of Fame inductee, Kid Cudi, because Pete Davidson referenced that his music saved his life. He mentioned that on The Breakfast Club in 2016. If you don't know what The Breakfast Club is, that's a radio show. They talk politics, life, rap, nationwide show. Great stuff. Check it out. Pete's star rose starting in 2014. He'd been in a lot of smaller projects with some of the SNL guys, and so got a crack at SNL in 2014, where he became the youngest cast member at the time, the first cast member born in the 90s, and one of the youngest ever. He took that stardom on to star in his own movie, Big Time Adolescence, and then he wrote and directed a movie that I really enjoyed called The King of Staten Island, certainly a Bro Motions heavy movie and a very authentic and vulnerable film. It's loosely based on himself and his story. So, the big things about Pete as far as being a Bro Motions Hall of Fame member, one, he's been willing to share this trauma and how it has impacted him. Notably, this first came to light in 2018 when he was on the Mark Maron podcast, and he talked about his drug use and his depression stemming from his recently diagnosed borderline personality disorder. I wanted to touch on this week, because next week we're going to touch all on borderline personality disorder and personality disorders in general. So it's often, not always, a manifestation of trauma. So it makes a lot of sense that Pete, losing his father as he did, struggled to establish safety in the world and struggled to establish much meaning after losing his father. And so it really was it was a huge deal at the time, if you remember, because he went from that podcast to talking about it on Weekend Update and SNL, talking about him going sober, was still using some marijuana. He had this interesting thought on it. But at the end of the day, people were not talking trauma in the spotlight like that. And over these last 5 years, it has been a major change. So I talked about Cudi kind of bringing that to light in the late 2000s. And then Pete Davidson doing another big bump for that stuff in the mid 2010s when he was honest about that diagnosis and how it has impacted him over his life. And so maybe being honest and authentic through all of the challenges Pete has struggled with is what gives him that big dick energy. So authenticity, vulnerability, women love that kind of thing, right? They love a project they can fix. Maybe it's something like that, because the boy has slayed, as we know. He dated Cassie David, that's right, Larry David's daughter, for a few years, Ariana Grande, Kate Beckinsale, Kim Kardashian, and Madeline Klein. So what I really appreciate about Pete is, through all of it, he's never one to shy away from sharing his thoughts and being honest, whether that be about his own struggles with mental health or on politics, where he's been outspoken on who he supports, ethics, where he spoke out against, in 2018 when the Catholic Church was, asked to pay a giant fine for pedophilia. He spoke out on that and even was continued to stand strong on it when the Catholic Church pressured him into apologizing. So, Pete is a unique soul. He is himself. He is not apologetic for that. And as we talked about with Cudi last week, he is not perfect. Pete, big shout out, man. You really took a lot of this struggle and you found a way to use it for good. You found a way to use that platform that you developed, the humor that has certainly been something you've had to use to cope with the pain. I think we all know that. And I want to make sure that you're getting those flowers that you deserve outside of what I assume is a fantastic sex life. So, Pete, great stuff, man. And we'll be back here in a minute to close out. All right, y'all, let's wrap up as we do, citing our sources and taking away. So sources, not a lot today, man. Just the Freud interview with Zack and I, that's just stuff we've learned. So I guess our source could be the CU psychiatry department that taught us so well and really burned a fire under us in terms of understanding psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapy, and Freud in particular. And our takeaways for today. First, the platinum rule, right? We all want to treat people well, if you're listening to this show especially. So the idea of treating people how you want to be treated, frankly, guys, it's not enough, right? And so I've talked about the difference between being nice and being kind. In order to be kind, we need to be able to understand other people's point of view. And so next time you're feeling judgmental, let's be curious and shoot for that platinum rule, which is treat people how they want to be treated. Number 2, Freud was a coked out pervert, and the dialectical and he was a good person, an advocate for LGBT communities, an advocate for trauma against women, and we owe him a lot in spite of how weird he got. Pete Davidson, like Kid Cudi, is another great example of our bro-emotional heroes don't necessarily have to be a certain way. He has been outspoken on mental health, and we owe him a lot for that. And so our third takeaway will be being honest and telling the truth can help everybody else around you set an example. So thanks, Pete, again. And again, guys, this week we'll end as we do by thinking to ourselves, let's get out in this world and let's find ways to be kinder and gentler. See y'all next week.